I live right outside of Los Angeles in Manhattan Beach, California.
Oh, thank you for bringing the nice weather with you, by the way. Appreciate it. So how long did you live here in the Boynton House?
So my parents bought the house in 1977,
Mm-hmm.
and then they sold the house in 1994. And so I lived here continuously other than heading off to college at Cornell University.
So you're a Rochester native as well, and
Yes,
you grew up here.
I went to East High School
Yeah.
from 1982 to 1997.
So besides the house changing, how's Rochester changed in that time?
Well, it's the only place I know that I can drive around without using Google Maps. So that's kind of helpful for me. I actually remember everything. You know, it kind of had a little downturn for a little bit, but it seems to be doing great. I love it. I do avoid coming here in the winter a lot, but I still love it. And I have friends here that I love to visit.
Talk to me what it was like growing up in this house.
So my parents, when they bought the house, the previous owners had a full schedule of tours. So for $1 or $2, people could have tour of the house, a docent-led tour. But my mom and dad were like, that's really not that practical. You know, they had my brother was 6 and I was 8 when we moved into the house. So they limited the tours to architecture professors, students, community groups, charitable organizations. But right off the bat, they said, okay, you and your brother have to be the leaders of the tour. So I'm 8 years old and I would stand right in front of the fireplace here. And my mom had these little note cards typed up, which I have them with me. She found them a few years ago in the back of a recipe box. And she would give us these little note cards and we would recite to these architecture students and professors all the details of the house. And one of my favorite details is on the fireplace. They're comprised of these little Roman bricks. And what Frank Lloyd Wright did is he took the mortar on the horizontal axis and he made it lighter and much deeper. And on the vertical axis, he made it much shallower and darker. So when you step away, it just looks like long bands of long bricks on emphasizing the horizontal. Now, when you're 8 years old and you're talking about that, you're like, woo, I'm so great, I know everything. And you'd be like, you have these professors sitting there with rapt attention listening to this 8-year-old talk.
Yeah,
It was fun.
I was gonna say, I can see the enthusiasm in your eyes. It must have been a really cool thing for you to do that age.
Yes, I really enjoyed it. I do think that once I became a teenager, I became much more self-conscious living in the house. When you're young, there's such a sense of pride. You want everybody to see it. You want to talk about it. When I was older, I felt like people would judge me about living in the house. So I would kind of downplay that I lived here or not really encourage people to have play dates in my house. So it was a little kind of an interesting path. And then of course, as an adult again, I'm like, that was a pretty special experience. It really was.
Yeah, so you mentioned you come back here to visit.
Mm-hmm.
Jane is very accommodating. What are some of the feelings you get when you come back here, come back to your childhood home?
Well, I wish our house looked like that when we lived here. My parents, well, we didn't have a lot of money when we lived here. Our furniture was pretty tattered and old. I'd like to say that my parents held this house together with Band-Aids and love. They just absolutely loved living here, and they were kind of like always staying one step ahead on all the repairs. I mean, the roof leaked a lot. They had to replace the roof, which cost almost as much as the house did when they purchased the house. So it was a bit of a struggle. They didn't always have a lot of extra money because it was, let's fix the house and let's do things. But when I see what Jane and Fran had done to this house, it's spectacular. I mean, Frank Lloyd Wright would give them a huge hug.
So what have you done since you've lived out of your house to learn more about the people who lived here, learn more about Frank Lloyd Wright in the house? Talk to me about some of the research you've done to learn more about this place.
So it was really interesting. I blew out my knee about 10 years ago. And I got stuck in bed and I said, you know what? People have always asked me, what was it like living in the Frank Lloyd Wright house? And I was like, I should write some stories. So I wrote up all the stories that I could remember. And I went to the little local copy shop. I bound all the stories and I gave them out to my parents and my brother and a couple people in Rochester, and I had a little note on there, and it said, read, edit, and enjoy. So I pretty much gave everybody homework as a gift. But what was amazing is that a couple days later, we got together, and my parents were like, oh no, we've got to talk about these stories. So my parents, my brother, and I all sat down, and we were like sharing stories. And I was like, come on, slow down. I got to write all these stories down. That gave me so much more information. Then I gave it to my sister-in-law, and she's like, I don't even know who Frank Lloyd Wright is. And I was like, okay, I might want to write a book that actually tells about, the architect and the history of the house. I had made such big assumptions. And then all of a sudden I realized there might be some legs to this. And then I got a phone call from PBS here in Rochester, and they said, we just read your book, and we would love to interview you and your mother going through the house and kind of have a lot of your archival photos and research. And I was like, how did you get my book? This is like a little bound, it looks terrible. And it turned out somebody in Rochester had given him a copy of the book. But that was really a great moment because they were going to film the house being restored, and that gave me an opportunity to have a deadline for the book. And then I did a deep dive and did all the research that I possibly could about the house. It was so much fun learning everything about the house. So this was a pretty new project for me.
Awesome. So what are, I'm not going to ask you to list everything out in dissertation format about what you learned, but what are, you mentioned that you had some assumptions about the house. What are some things that you can maybe specifically identify that you had assumed about the house and had assumed about its history that were really proven to be completely different than what you thought?
Well, I know this sounds so naive. So I grew up here. I lived here for the longest time. And when my parents talked about this house, and we visited other houses. My mom used to be the person who would have a picture of our house in her wallet next to the JCPenney pictures of us and be like, we live in a Frank Lloyd Wright house too. Can you let us in? And every time we'd get a tour of the house, you really learn about that house, the architecture, the structure of the house. And I had been telling stories about the house, but I didn't know anything about Frank Lloyd Wright at all. I mean, I even remember reading Loving Frank and being like, I did not know anything about his scandalous love life or the murders, and there's arson, and I'm not going to ruin it for anybody, but he had quite a life. So it's really interesting when you go on tours of a lot of the houses, they really focus on the architecture instead of about the man behind the work. So, but what I really learned in this house is that Frank Lloyd Wright had the most incredible long-lasting career, and he kept on reinventing himself. Like the houses in California, these textile block houses, they look completely different than this prairie style house that I grew up in. And then he'd reinvent himself again. He'd try and make a Usonian house for everybody. I mean, if you look, you're like, I cannot believe that one person could create so many different things and so many beautiful things.
Now talk to me about this two-person play that you're doing in Rochester.
So after I wrote the book, Growing Up in a Frank Lloyd Wright House, and then I was in that PBS documentary, I started doing talks all over the country about growing up in a Frank Lloyd Wright house. And one thing that was always interesting to me was Beulah Boynton. So this house was designed for Edward E. Boynton and his 20-year-old daughter Beulah. She was 20 when the house was completed. So she was very involved with Frank Lloyd Wright in terms of, reading plans and making contributions. So I found her story really fascinating of how she grew up with this house. And the more research I did, the more I learned that she didn't want to use Frank Lloyd Wright. She wanted to use Claude Bragdon, who was another architect here in town, there's some houses on Hawthorne that he had designed. He was the most famous architect in Rochester. And so as I was researching and finding all these archival materials in the downtown library, it was really neat to hear that story. And then I decided to juxtapose it with my experience of growing up in the house. So I have it's a two-person play with Beulah Boynton and Kim, And it kind of weaves the two stories of living in this house 70 years apart. So it's really interesting.
Who is playing the role of Kim and who is playing the role of Boynton?
Well, I have asked a local actress here in Rochester to play the role of Beulah. And well, unfortunately, I have to take my second choice, which is me, to play myself. I'm not a professional actress, and I would prefer to be about 15 years younger, but you know, we have to settle for certain things. So I'm going to be playing myself, and in this performance, I have a local actress that is going to be playing the part of Beulah. So I really, and what I'm hoping is that at the end of the shows that I get feedback, because there's nothing like a hometown audience to give you the honest feedback.
Yeah, awesome. So what, besides feedback, what is something you want people to take away from the play after watching it?
The power of place. It's really amazing how the power a place can have in impacting, like how it can have ripples throughout your whole life, how it can impact your aesthetic, like what you like later in life, what kind of house you want to live in. Like to me, I tell people I want something with a tremendous amount of wood that's very contemporary. And not a lot of people say, oh, that doesn't really work. But this house is that. It's this, you know, contemporary house that's a craftsman style house. I also find that the people influence a house as well. So not only can a house influence the people, but that people, how it changes the house and the path the house has gone through. And if you look at a history just of the outside, the exterior of the house, and it's fascinating, in the 60s, the people who lived here, they let the front bushes grow up. I have an amazing picture all the way to the second story. You cannot see the house at all. And I talked to them about that, and they said, well, we thought Frank Lloyd Wright wanted privacy. And you know, really it was them wanting the privacy. So it's interesting how the houses reflected the people as well.
Very cool. So just to so we talked about, I think that covers it for now. Anything that I didn't ask about that you would like to add or you feel is pertinent to this conversation? Oh yeah, so the only last thing I wanted to say is that when we lived here, you know, my mom and dad really made a point of making it feel like a home. I mean, we ran around this house. We were playing games all the time. My mom hosted these fun, informal parties. And, you know, there are 17 pieces of original furniture in this house, which is pretty remarkable of any Frank Lloyd Wright structure. And we sat at the dining room table. We sat in a Frank Lloyd Wright table and, you know, and ate our dinner, you know, every night. And it was just such a wonderful home for us. So I want to thank my parents for making it feel so warm and inviting. And I also want to thank Jane and Fran for, you know, making this look beautiful, inviting, and spectacular. I did remember what I wanted to ask. So what do you do now that you're living in LA?
So I write books. I've written several books.
Oh, really?
Yes. So
Yeah.
I wrote a few books right after graduating from college. And then this is my most recent book, and I go around and I do speaking engagements for schools, for architects. They get continuing education credit for this. Yeah. The first time that someone asked me to do a kindergarten class, I was like, kindergartners, what am I going to talk about? And so I was like, okay. So I led with Frank Lloyd Wright has 5 Lego sets, and every kid's like, whoa, he must be famous. That's it. And so I had them hooked right off.
I was going to say, I might have to find those Lego
I
sets.
I know.
That is fantastic.
It is pretty amazing.
So did you go to school for architecture?
I did not. Nothing to do with that.
So what did you go to school for?
I went to Cornell, and I ended up going to just taking anything that I wanted to. Yeah. I just did not know what I wanted to be, but I ended up majoring in political science and did nothing for it. And I try not to talk about it at all now.
I can understand why.
Yeah.
So as an author, do you mainly just write books about architecture, and like is it?
No, so everything I've written has been nonfiction. Well, one of them was a guide to Ithaca and Cornell. One of them was a little gift book. A couple people had me work on children's books with them. And then the other thing that I do, well, I can't believe I'm so remiss to mention that, is that my mom is a jeweler, and I've been doing her bookkeeping for, like 35 years. And she got audited many, many decades ago, in the early 90s, late 80s. And so I consider myself, when I wasn't doing the bookkeeping, my dad was doing it, and then they were fighting. So I really think of myself as bookkeeper / marriage counselor, and my parents are still together, so I've done my job.
I think so. Awesome. Thank you, Kim. Appreciate it.